This is an account taken from the memoirs of Joseph Plum Martin. It's a book that I've referenced a number of times here on the channel. A little closer for you, though, just so you can always see in case you haven't seen the other videos for it. It is a very, very fascinating account, basically, of a continental soldier who enlists from New England early on in the war and serves throughout basically the entire thing. Basically, he recounts his experiences and tells his story as he experienced the war. It's not a high-minded tale of generals and heroic actions. It's, well, honestly, the majority of the story is him complaining about how hungry, tired, and cold he is, because that is indeed the more common experience of a soldier. Not the heroism and adventure of a daring battle, but struggling to find food and survive the privations of war. And he writes extensively about this. Indeed, the subtitle, if you will, of the book is here we have, Some of the Adventures, Dangers, and Sufferings of Joseph Plum Martin. So it's a very good book. I suggest you give it a read if you have not already. But at the very end of the book, spoiler alert, by the way, at the very end of the book, he talks about a rising sentiment in the independent United States. The book was written after the war, but after the independence was won, after the war was won, immediately the histories of the war begin to pass into memory and into legend, into a more romanticized, idealized version of what had actually happened. And as it is nowadays, I think, at least as I was taught this war in grade school, I think these rumors, these legends, these false ideals of history have really persisted and perhaps even grown stronger than they had in the day that Mr. Martin was writing, and I think that is quite sad. There was an idea rising that the militia were the ones to win the American War of Independence. It was merely the armed population, the armed civilian population, the average man on the street who was able to take up arms against the tyrannical foe and win the nation's independence. That the Continental Army, on the other hand, was largely a waste of time, that they certainly helped, but they were not the ones to actually win the war. It was all the militia. The militia were sufficient. That's the idea that's beginning to get its rise in these early days of the independent American Republic. And of course, Joseph Plum Martin, being a veteran of the war, who had suffered, for what, nearly 300 pages here. He's listing off the extent to which he has suffered through the war for the independence of his nation, and he feels as if he's been forgotten about, because the people are now saying that that men like him and all their sufferings were not important, they weren't necessary, they were largely a waste of resources, that they didn't really have to do anything at all. It would have been the militia were enough to win the war. He feels deeply offended by these false sentiments, and I think it's understandable that he does. So I'll now read, at the very end of the book again, a section where he talks about this issue, if you will, and his feelings towards it. He writes as such. It has been said by some that ought to be better employed that the Revolutionary Army was needless, that the militia were competent for all that the crisis required. Now that there was then, and now is in the militia, as brave and as good men as were ever in any army since the creation, I am ready and willing to allow. But there are many among them too, I hope the citizen soldiers will be as ready to allow, who are not so good as regulars. Regular being the Continental Army, as he was. And I affirm that the militia would not have answered so well as standing troops, for the following reason among many others. They would not have endured the sufferings the army did. They would have considered themselves, as in reality they were and are, free citizens, not bound by any cords that were not of their own manufacturing, and when the hardships of fatigue, starvation, cold, and nakedness, which I have just mentioned, begun to seize upon them in such awful array as they did on us, they would have instantly quitted the service in disgust. And who would blame them? I am sure that I could hardly find it in my heart to do it. That the militia did good and great service in that war, as well as in the last on particular occasions, I well know, for I have fought by their side. but still I insist that they would not have answered the end so well as regular soldiers, unless they were very different people from what I believe and know them to be, as well as I wish to know. Upon every exigency, they would have been to be collected. And what would the enemy have been doing in the meantime? The regulars were there, and there obliged to be. We could not go away when we pleased without exposing ourselves to military punishment, and we had enough trouble to undergo without that. It was likewise said at the time that the army was idle, did nothing but lounge about from one station to another, eating the country's bread and wearing her clothing, without rendering her any essential service. And I wonder that they did not add spending the country's money, too. It would have been quite as consistent with the other charges. Here, Mr. Martin is rather sarcastically replying to the fact that the nation very rarely fed the army, they very rarely clothed the army as they promised to, and they never paid the army as they promised to. He had complained about that sufficiently earlier on. "You ought to drive on," said they. "You are competent for the business. Rid the country at once of her invaders." Poor, simple souls! It was very easy for them to build castles in the air, but they had not felt the difficulty of making them stand there. It was easier with them taking whole armies in a warm room and by a good fire than enduring the hardships of one cold winter's night upon a bleak hill without clothing or victuals. If the Revolutionary Army was really such an useless appendage to the cause, such a nuisance as it was then and has since been said to be, why was it not broken up at once? Why were we not sent off home and obliged to maintain ourselves? Surely it would have been as well for us soldiers, and according to the reckoning of those wiseacres, it would have been much better for the country to have done it, than for us to have been eating so much provisions, and wearing out so much clothing, when our services were more than useless. We could have made as good militiamen as though we had been discharged from the army, have saved the country a world of expense, and I say we should have saved ourselves a world of trouble in having our constitutions broken down and our joints dislocated by trotting after Bellona's car. But the poor, old, decrepit soldiers, after all that has been said to discourage them, have found friends in the community. And I trust there are many, very many, that are sensible to the usefulness of that suffering army, although perhaps all their voices have not been so loud in its praise as the voice of slander has been against it. President Monroe was the first of all our presidents, except President Washington, who ever uttered a syllable in the old soldier's favor. President Washington urged the country to do something for them and not to forget their hard services. But President Monroe told them how to act. He had been a soldier himself in the darkest period of the war, that point of it that emphatically tried men's souls, was wounded, and knew what soldiers suffered. His good intentions, being seconded by some revolutionary officers then in Congress, brought about a system by which, aided by our present worthy Vice President, then Secretary of War, heaven bless him, many of the poor men who had spent their youthful and consequently their best days in the hard service of their country have been enabled to eke out the fag end of their lives a little too high for the groveling hand of envy or the long arm of poverty to reach. Many murmur now at the apparent good fortune of the poor soldiers. Many I have myself seen vile enough to say that they never deserved such favor from the country. The only wish I would bestow upon such hard-hearted wretches is that they might be compelled to go through just such sufferings and privations as that army did, and then, if they did not sing a different tune, well, I should miss my guess. But I really hope these people will not go beside themselves. Those men whom they wished to die on a dunghill, men who, if they had not ventured their lives in battle and faced poverty, disease, and death for their country, to gain and maintain that independence and liberty in the sunny beams of which they, like reptiles, are basking, they would, many or most of them, be this moment in as much need of help and succor as ever, as the most indignant soldier was before he experienced his country's beneficence. The soldiers consider it cruel to be thus vilified, and it is as cruel as the grave to any man, when he knows his own rectitude of conduct, to have his hard services not only debased and underrated, but scandalized and vilified. But the revolutionary soldiers are not the only people that endure obloquy. Others, as meritorious and perhaps more deserving than they, are forced to submit to ungenerous treatment. But if the old revolutionary pensioners are really an eyesore, a grief of mind to any man or set of men, and I know they are, let me tell them that if they will exercise a very little patience, a few years longer will put all of them beyond the power of troubling them. For they will soon be where the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest. So, he has a few more closing moments there, but I think I've read enough of that passage. What Joseph Plum Martin is saying is that after the Continental Army had suffered so very long to win independence for the United States, the myth of the American militiaman, the myth of the idea of the common man taking up arms to defend his town and village and then go back home at the end of the day, and that being sufficient to actually maintain the Tree of Liberty, the myth is insulting, genuinely insulting and detrimental to the memory, and indeed, in this time period, to the service of the Continental Army. They were suffering actively, not only their memory, but the men themselves suffering underneath that misconception, because the population was so unwilling, apparently, to actually give them the credit and the welfare which they deserved, which they had won for themselves. It was only after a number of old veterans themselves in the government had managed to convince the nation to provide them some little handout that, to prevent the soldiers from having to live out the rest of their days as beggars. And at the very end, his ending note is saying that, you know what? If we are really, as we as Continental soldiers are really that much of a trouble to you, then don't worry, because you know what? We're all going to be dead in a couple of years' time anyways, and after that, you can be free of our detrimental effects on your society. And so sad it is that it does seem that after these Continental soldiers have passed away, so many people, even to the present day, seem to maintain and believe so strongly that myth that the American militiaman was all that was required to win the war. That the Continental Army, because this is the implication, if you do indeed agree that the militiamen were all that were needed to free the nation of its tyrannical overlords, the implication is indeed that the Continental Army was a waste, and that they were undeserving of the praise that they should have received, and that they deserved the treatment that they got because they were a waste. It's rather depressing that we've gone that way, that because we laud the militiaman so much, the man who, if he happened to get tired and feel as if it wasn't worth it, could just go home, that we forget the men who, if ever they felt hungry or homesick or weary, as Joseph Plum Martin never did, well, that they did not have the ability, they did not have the right to go home, because if they did, they would face military discipline, floggings, firing squads, court-martials. They were under military discipline. They did not have the right to go home. They were held under military discipline. I've repeated myself a great deal, but I think the overall point has been gotten across. The militiamen were not sufficient to win the war, and whether or not an armed population under the idea of the Second Amendment would be sufficient nowadays, if the idea of the militia group would be sufficient to win American independence from a tyrannical government in the present day, I will not comment on that, because of course, again, the situation has so dramatically been changed. But in the 18th century, very unlike the 21st century, of course, were they sufficient in the 18th century to win independence? No, they were not. So congratulations, you suffered through all of that and you made it to the end of the video. So allow me to just offer a very quick summary of everything that I've said, because I've already repeated myself a great deal, so I'll make this quick. In the 18th century, was the allotment, or the rights, the privileges, however you want to phrase it, of the Second Amendment, wherever those rights or privileges may come from, be they God or man or what have you, was that which the Second Amendment provides for, an armed population with well-regulated militias and all that, was that sufficient in the 18th century to actually win the American independence? And the answer, at least if you trust what I've told you so far and you believe the words of a veteran of that war, well, no. No, the Second Amendment was far from sufficient in those early days from winning American independence. Oh, I look forward so very much to the angry comments I'm sure I will get down below with this one. But even with that being said, I am, and of course I shall remain, my dear viewer, your most humble and obedient of servants.